Do not buy land in the Aledo area until you watch this video to the very end. Now, if this is your first time on the channel and you want to know everything there is to know about living in the Aledo area, make sure you hit that subscribe button and tap the bell for notifications to make sure you're the first to know about what's going on in the Aledo market. Now, I know a lot of you love the idea of buying land and building your dream home on it. So today we're going to be discussing just the purchase of that land and the important things to consider. And if this is kind of an exciting process for you and you want to know more about the building process and building on your own land, hit that subscribe button so you get the notification when that email comes out in the future. And before I forget, there is going to be a link where you can browse land listings in Aledo, no sign-in required. So if you're interested, go check it out. Happy to let you browse with no pressure. So let's get into it. So let's jump in to the 5 things you need to know before buying land in the Aledo area. My name's Jared with Living in Aledo, Texas, and I get calls and texts all the time from people just like yourself who are thinking about moving to the Aledo area, and I love it. So whether you're thinking about moving next week or next year, all my contact information is in the description box below. Feel free to reach out however is most convenient. I'm looking forward to helping you make a smooth move to the Aledo area. So the number one thing you need to know and decide before you start looking for land in the Aledo area is whether or not you want to be inside an HOA or a homeowners association. So that's really important for a couple of reasons, because an HOA is going to really determine how you can use your property. So if you have any special uses or special things you want to be able to do, then an HOA may or may not be a good fit for you. And that's going to really restrict your options. For example, if you have horses and you want to be able to keep horses on your property with you, there are very few HOAs that allow that. And if you move outside of anything other than horses and like normal domesticated pets, HOAs will severely restrict that. You know, do you want bunnies? Do you want chickens? Do you want cows? Very few HOAs start allowing those additional things. Now, chickens are the most common. We've had chickens in the past, but our current HOA does not allow us to have chickens per the rules. The other thing is, do you maybe want to operate your business out of your house? And now I don't mean do you want to work from home. I mean, like, do you have some sort of service-based business, maybe with trucks, vans, trailers, something like that, and you want to use your home as kind of your main base where maybe you're storing or parking a tractor trailer or dumpster trailers, or, I don't know, maybe you're parking, 2 or 3 HVAC service vans, something like that. HOAs are typically going to be like ixnay. You may not operate a business from your house if there are those types of things that are like being left out. And it may not be that the paperwork for the HOA says you can't run a business. It's going to say stuff like you can't park commercial vehicles, or you can't have more than X number of vehicles parked for more than 2 days, or you can't operate commercial activities from your lot. So those are going to be some things that HOAs won't allow you to do. The other thing is, like, do you want to make sure that your neighbors are going to be similar types of properties or similar value properties? You could buy something way out in the country, but you may have no control over what your neighbor does. So if you want to be surrounded by similar type properties to make sure that your home values stay up, or there's other homes to keep your values up, that would be something to consider. And then, do you potentially want to have some sort of amenities? Well, HOAs are the only way to get like included amenities. So that's just a really entry-level first decision to make. And we're going to get into more of like what type of restrictions and how that could come in a minute. But very first decision, HOA or no HOA. Okay, so the number 2 thing you need to consider is the location of that land, and maybe like the topography, and those kind of go hand in hand because general locations will have similar topography in what you're looking for and expecting and desiring. And the land location is actually when someone sends me a lot or a parcel of land they're interested in, the very first thing I do is pull up the flood map, because a lot of the available land that sits for sale and doesn't sell relatively quickly in the Aledo area tends to be partially in or very close to a floodplain. And so that is something to consider if that's something you want to deal with. Now, you can buy property in a floodplain. You just need to get additional insurance. If you're gonna have a loan, it's required. If you're even near a floodplain, it is probably a wise decision to get supplemental flood insurance. I have a client who has worked for FEMA and the Corps of Engineers, and he has walked me through some information and shared some info. When I say not reliable, I don't mean that they're no good. I just mean that the potential for flooding is sometimes greater than what the map indicates, because they only get updated every, maybe like 10 years or something. If you're anywhere near a flood zone, you want to double check maybe your base flood elevation, your BFE. You want to, figure out where your home might sit and where that specific parcel is or piece of land is above the floodplain, and then whether or not it's worth building there at all. And then a couple other considerations that are typically more preferential are trees. My clients, and I've had some mention them recently, and I've had other clients in the past talk about how the trees and the mature trees were super important to them. And that's one of the reasons they weren't looking at new construction homes, because they're pretty bare. And the reason I say this is because there's a lot of land available that might be more like prairie land or old farmland, and there's not going to be much trees out there. So that's something to consider whether you want a treed lot or not. Now, the con of buying that has a lot of trees on it is that that's some additional cost when you need to clear that and develop your pad site and do all the construction. Is there's additional work and lot prep to do, but that might be worth it if you want that treed lot, which can be super beautiful when all the the trees are out and the leaves are there. So that's something to consider. And then the other thing, which for the most part might not be as crazy important, but can impact your costs when building, is the slope of the lot, because even a minor slope over a large space could lead to some grading issues or additional costs when it comes to grading. You might have to build up the area where your home pad site's going to be. And then if you want to do anything with a backyard or create a pool or landscaping or outdoor kitchen, there may be additional work that goes into landscaping and grading everything. So typically, the flatter lot you can get, the better, unless you have a specific plan and goal. It can be a really awesome site to have a home a little higher up, maybe a slight hill or a slight elevation. And then if it overlooks, maybe a lot of pasture land, that can be really pretty. Even sometimes, having it overlook a really nicely done and renovated or upscale backyard kind of oasis environment, that can be really nice if you're overlooking something like that and it's not obstructing your views. When it comes to overall cost, flat might be best. But when it comes to views, lookouts, designs, layouts, and kind of the aesthetic, maybe it is a little nicer to have something that has a little bit of, texture to the topography. And then the other end of that is you might not want to be right up against a bluff or something, that totally blocks out your line of sight or your view. And I've seen some lots where it's like the backyard, it's a straight up bluff, so you've got the house, a small backyard, and then like stone. And that may also not be what you want. So that's something to consider as well when it comes to land, location, topography, tree coverage, stuff like that. Okay, so number 3 is understanding possible restrictions associated with any specific lot you're looking at. Now, this is going to be heavily impacted by your first choice, whether you were looking at an HOA or no HOA. But I really wanted to make it a different thought process, right? Because really two separate things, because you could potentially have restrictions no matter what lot or where you build, potentially, and I'm going to get into that. Because first off, your most restrictive building environment is going to be inside a neighborhood that has an HOA. They're going to control everything from the size of your home, potentially to the number of stories. And I say control. They're going to have guidelines around what you're allowed and not allowed to do. But construction style, maybe the type of roof you have, if you can have additional structures on your property. So for example, some neighborhoods will not allow additional dwelling units, like a mother-in-law suite, to be a separate structure. So I've actually had a client who, they built these designs in advance because they knew they couldn't do this. They had their main house designed, and then they had a porte-cochere, so it was part of the roof line of the house, extended over, and then they built their mother-in-law suite attached to that. So the home was considered one structure because it had an attached roof line, even though it was separate, dwelling units. If you didn't count that, had a porte-cochere you could drive through and you parked in the back. If you can build additional structures, like a storage unit in the back or a detached garage, they may say, like my neighborhood says this, is you can build them, but one, they have to be approved, and two, they have to be of a similar or matching construction style and quality to your primary residence on the home. If you have a brick home, you can't build a siding, a detached garage that just has siding. It has to like be matching or similar quality and style brick. They're going to control like sometimes even how many domesticated animals. If you can park an RV or a boat on your property, they might have restrictions around that. So my neighborhood with its HOA is actually a more relaxed HOA. Our documents do allow for homeowners to park RVs, boats, and trailers on their lot where they're visible. However, they have to be set back 50 feet from the front line of the house. So it's kind of goofy, you know, sometimes it's kind of close, but some HOAs will say if you have it on your property, it can't be visible. And then some, you know, maybe say you can't have it at all unless it's parked inside of a garage, you know. So you could get a boat in a garage, but it's kind of expensive to build a garage that an RV can fit in. So that would be an added expense. You have to park that somewhere else and pay those kinds of storage fees. But even if you're not an HOA, if you're inside city limits, you're going to have city ordinances and city restrictions that could apply. Now, most of those are going to be much more general, not as strict. You know, they're not going to say you can't park cars in your driveway, and you can park cars in the street, but they may say, hey, it has to be a functioning vehicle, right? So you can't have a car on cinder blocks in your driveway if you're inside the city. It's the second tightest level of controls. They're going to have zoning requirements. They're going to have setbacks. So maybe, you know, they'll have a front setback from the street, and then they might have side setbacks, so you can't build something all the way up to your property line. And you may have to get permits in order to, you know, build your pool, additional structures, storage sheds, stuff like that. There are still going to be some level of restrictions. So depending on what you want to do, you want to make sure you understand what those restrictions are. Now, the least restrictive type of land to buy is land in unincorporated areas of the county, so outside city limits. And sometimes there are zero restrictions. However, even these properties can sometimes still have deed restrictions. So maybe the owner or a prior owner recorded restrictions as a part of that land in the past. Now, normally they're going to be relatively minor compared to everything else. So maybe it's like 1 horse per acre. Maybe it's no trailers on the property, or you can't live on a trailer. But you know, they're going to be a lot more flexible, a lot more open to what you want to do. But the thing is you still need to check. Just because it's not in the city limits doesn't mean you can do whatever you want. It's still something that needs to be double checked to make sure there aren't some sort of deed restrictions. And then the other thing is if you're buying land and you're going to build and you're outside city limits, you need to make sure that property is going to sustain a well and a septic. So we're going to hop into utilities next. Okay, so the number 4 thing that you need to know when buying land or a lot in the Aledo area is whether or not that lot is going to be able to have city utilities. Because even if you're inside city limits, it's not a guarantee that the city utilities are going to be affordable. Because let's pretend that you do buy a lot inside the city and it does not already have utilities ran across the lot. If you need to bring in the city utilities where the main city lines are not already in front of your lot, and it's more than just like a tap fee, which we're not getting into all the costs today. But if they have to extend their city lines to get to your property, guess who pays for that? You do as the owner. And guess what? You get to pay government rates, which are not discounted, they're inflated. That's a side note, but it is not cheap if you need to bring city lines into your property the vast majority of the time. Now, if you're inside a development that's already in place, most of the time the developer has already ran city lines across all the lots and you're not going to be really concerned about that. But if you're looking at an older neighborhood, maybe in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and there's a lot that's still there, you would want to double check that the utilities are ran in a way that is feasible for you to use. Now, let's say you're not in the city limits. First set of utilities that you need to think about is your water and your sewer. So what you're going to be on is a private water well and a private septic system. And there are some requirements around those. Just because you're outside the city limits doesn't mean you get to do whatever you want. Most of Parker County, and which encompasses all the Aledo area, is in the Upper Trinity Groundwater Preservation District or something like that. and they regulate wells, water wells, the land, and have guidelines around like placement of wells and septic systems. And so in Parker County, you have to have a 2-acre minimum in order to have a well and a septic on your property. Now, I only have 1 acre, but that's because that's what the regulations were at the time, and they can't retroactively change that. But for new properties, if you are looking at something outside the city limits and you need a well and a septic, you need to make sure you're buying at least 2 acres to make sure that that is feasible for you. In Tarrant County, it's still a 1 acre minimum requirement to have a well and a septic. Now, what about power? Power is not nearly as expensive to bring in as like city water lines, but something that you might want to know is the power going to be provided by Encore, infrastructure provider that lets you choose whatever power company you want to work with, or is the power going to be provided by Tri-County Electric, where you have to buy the electricity from them directly? I've heard that they're a little bit more expensive than like the open market, which would make sense. If you control your power lines, it makes sense that you might charge a little bit more. I do think they're regulated to some degree, but even with like the regulation, typically an open market of electricity providers you can choose from might end up being a little bit cheaper. So you've got your water, your sewer, your electric. One of the next big things is internet. So are there internet lines anywhere near? Will there be? What's the service going to look like? It used to be that something like Nextlink was pretty much your only option, which I think for the most part, they operated off like satellite dishes and radio waves. So they weren't like cheap. When I've looked at them, they are as much or more than paying for like AT&T internet, and they weren't super fast. Nowadays, you get Starlink. So that's probably going to be a safe bet to consider. I have at least one client in the Aledo area who was in a neighborhood that did have an old AT&T line, I think, or not an old one, a new one, but it wasn't fiber. And so he decided to go with Starlink, and that's been a great fit for him. He works from home and it's super reliable. I don't make anything off Starlink. I don't have it, but he had good things to say about it and has enjoyed using Starlink. And then the last thing really is trash. There are actually a handful of private garbage companies that you can pay a monthly fee, and they'll come and pick up, they'll give you a garbage can just like the city, and they'll pick up, your garbage, once or twice a week. So I think in our neighborhood in McDavid Estates, we have maybe 3, possibly 4 different private trash companies that come through and service our neighborhood because our HOA doesn't control who you use, which I think is typically a benefit, but that does mean there's a lot of additional like trash traffic coming through. So some neighborhoods, maybe it's one, maybe the HOA contracts it and it's included in your HOA fees. Or if not, you could potentially be so far out in the country they don't service you. And so I have seen some homes that they have like a small like dumpster on their property. Think like something you'd see behind like a commercial strip center. And they fill that up and then they pay for one-off charges for a dump truck to come and like dump the big bin of trash and take that. Unless you're like way out, you're probably gonna have some level of trash service, but that's also something to consider. And just know that the Aledo area, Parker County area, does have multiple private trash services you can work with. Okay, so the 5th thing that I think you need to decide before going out and looking for land, and arguably you could put this at the very front of the list, but is how much land do you want? Do you want a 1/4 acre lot? Do you want an acre? Do you want 2 acres? Do you want 5? Do you want 20? Do you want 30? So this is something that, is probably going to be informed by the usage that you have in mind and honestly, your price range. So when looking at buying land and building for a normal home, like the average home, I don't know, let's just say sub $1 million. Just, that's not necessarily the normal range for everyone. But let's create this category of sub $1 million homes. The general rule of thumb for builders until the market went nuts was that you really wanted the land that you had to buy to be about 20% of the overall value of the property when you were done. So maybe for $1 million home, you would be willing to spend $200,000 for that land. Now, if you're getting into large acreage, that's gonna change. But if you're looking at something in the realm of normal 20 to 25% end value that you have in mind might be the land purchase price. Now that's got out of whack a little bit because the market went crazy a couple years ago, and now construction costs are super high. So that's not something that I can tell you exactly where you should be on any given property right now without having details, but that's something to consider. You need to make sure that your land purchase is, integrated into the plan of where your home value is going to be. because there's two extremes. One, you could buy a ton of property and you could put a mobile home on there, and maybe that property ends up never being worth more than land value because what you put on there isn't a good return for an investment, long term. Or the other end of the spectrum is maybe you buy a half-acre lot in a residential neighborhood. Doesn't really matter how nice of a home you put on that. That's going to have an upper limit to its value. Now in the Aledo area, you can still have really nice homes and really expensive homes on smaller pieces of land. Maybe that's a large lot. But other factors go into that. So you look at like Walsh Ranch and you have Klein Park, the kind of the luxury section of Walsh Ranch. Sure, you have $1 million+ homes on a half acre, but that half acre anywhere else doesn't have the amenities that Walsh has. So if you're looking at multi-million-dollar home value when you're done, you can buy multiple acres. If you're like, I don't have the money to build a multi-million-dollar home, and you're looking at something more in the normal range, maybe you end up looking at 1 to 2 acres because it might be hard to, overbuild that, but yet you're still going to get a really good return on value when you're done. And there's a lot of moving parts in that, but just something to think about. And then the last thing when it comes to like land size is, are you trying to qualify for any specific exemptions? And really, I'm just talking about the ag exemption specifically. So on a primary residence, doesn't matter the lot size, you can qualify for your homestead exemption in Texas, which helps reduce your property taxes. But if you are looking at doing something agriculturally and you want to try to reduce your tax burden on that land, you can't get that. You can't get an ag exemption on 1 acre. Most ag exemptions are going to have at least 10 to 15 acres. And then there's some activities that you may only have to have like 5 acres. Like for example, you might be able to get an ag exemption on as little as 5 acres if you are keeping like honeybees and producing honey with those honeybees. Now, a little side note is my HOA technically allows beekeeping, but because I only have 1 acre, I would not qualify for an ag exemption. So, and I only know this because my wife brought it up. I have a client who keeps bees and produces a lot of honey, and so my wife was looking into it, got really interested in it, is thinking about it, and I was like, a while back, it's like, oh, what was there? I'm in a residential neighborhood. Could I get an ag exemption? The answer is no, because I don't have enough land to qualify for it. If you only have 1 acre, they know that's a personal use property and it's not an agricultural primary use property. So if you're looking for ag exemptions, horses, sheep, goats, cattle, whatever that might be, there's a number of ways to qualify. You do have to have a minimum amount of land in order to qualify for that. So something else to consider if you're looking at multiple acres in your potential land purchase and home construction. Okay, so I have a bonus number 6 for you. And this is one that I really think is important to think about, because we need to know what your timeline is. If you're thinking about building on your own land, I've had clients approach me and say, hey, I think now might be a good time to buy land. I don't want to build yet. I may want to build in 5 years or 10 years. I want to hold on to some land while it's, maybe relatively affordable, hold on to it and build in the future. And then other times clients are looking for something right then that they want to move on and build on immediately. And the reason this is important is because if you're looking at properties inside HOAs, some HOAs have requirements around when you must start building after purchase. I've seen some HOAs that say construction must begin within 1 year of purchasing of a lot. And then they might say that the construction has to be completed in a reasonable time frame. And they might say, no more than 1 year. So if you're looking for a long-term investment that will eventually turn into maybe a build with a construction, not a purchase, you already purchased the land, then you need to know that, and that needs to be double checked. But not all HOAs are like that. My neighborhood, just from experience, was built in the late 90s, early 2000s, and there is a lot that is just now being built on. It's been bought and sold a number of times over the years, but we didn't have any sort of requirements on when construction must start. But then when construction starts, it's supposed to be done within like a year or something like that. So that's a bonus. That's not going to apply everywhere. If your home's not in the city limits or just in the normal city, you probably won't have to worry about that at all, but it is something to consider. Okay, so if you made it to the end of the video and you still think that buying land and building your dream home might be a great option for you, hit that subscribe button so you get notified when a future video comes out that I'll be doing about the build process on your own land. And if you want to start looking at land immediately, there's going to be a link in the description that requires no sign-in. It does not require an email. You can just browse land listings in the Aledo ISD area, because I want you to be able to see whatever you're interested in with no pressure. And remember, whether you're thinking about moving next week or next year, All my contact information is in the description box below. Feel free to reach out however is most convenient for you. I'm looking forward to helping you make a smooth move to the Aledo area.